What's up, YouTubers and plant lovers? It's Justin coming to you from the Big Blue Nation once again. And today, I was going to talk to you about a cardboard palm. Now, the only other name that I've ever heard it called is the cardboard plant and the cardboard palm. But it's actually Zamia furfuracea is the scientific name. And just like its name suggests, it is not a palm. It is actually a cycad, just like the king sago, the queen sago, the Coontie, but it is a prehistoric plant from at least around the Jurassic period, around the time of the dinosaurs. Now, why this plant has lived for such a long time and others haven't is a really good question. Now, I know it's kind of a tough eat, and it is a really tough plant. It can withstand a lot in different weather conditions. It is slightly cold tolerant, I think down to about 25 degrees. So unless you're living in like zones 10 and 11, you really can't have this plant outside unless it's a container plant. Now, it is native to kind of southeastern Mexico, around Veracruz, and the Gulf of Mexico also. Kind of along that period right there. So it is kind of semi-desert, but it does get a little bit of rain. So it's not a real kind of desert plant, but like I said, it is tropical. It is around the equator. So it does like kind of average humidity to kind of low humidity, but really good sunlight. I think they classify it around kind of bright to direct sunlight. But just like the king sago and the queen sago, this plant isn't as popular. It gets its name from the really thick kind of leaves that are really kind of tough, and they kind of just look like a piece of cardboard really, but they're great plants to have. I mean, they are relatively slow growing plants, kind of like a sago, so they do take a little bit of time to have invested in them, and they are kind of slow growing like I said, but they do get rather large. They can be kind of a low plant around the ground, but it can spread out to about 6 feet. So they can get kind of large, but mostly they do kind of stay low to the ground, and they'll be kind of bush-like actually. But I really fell in love with this plant when I got it. I've always had a sago palm, and I've never had one of these before, but this plant is a really great plant to have. And as you can tell, the leaves are kind of swaying in one direction. It has a little bit of elevation to it, so it is really kind of lanky because of that. I set it on my back porch and just kind of forgot about it, and that's really what you can do with these plants. They don't need a whole lot in the way of water, and as long as they're getting moderate sunlight, they're usually pretty good. But like I said, I kind of sat mine in the same position, kind of forgot to rotate it, so I noticed whenever I started to bring these guys in for the fall that this one didn't really look as best as I kind of wanted it to, so I wanted to go ahead and do a video on that and kind of tell you more about it and transplant it. So that's what I'm going to do today, is show you really how to transplant this guy. Now, as I was saying, a lot of people call it a palm. It is not. And it can be kind of confused for a fern also. It does kind of like unfurl its leaves, kind of like a fiddlehead, like a fern would. So a lot of people probably do think that it is kind of like fern or related to a fern, but it's not. What it is these cones are in the middle of the pot here, and that's where all of its leaves will unfurrow and grow off. And these plants can be either male or female, and at first it can be really hard to determine whether you have a male or a female plant, but usually with the males the cones will be a little bit larger. The cone for both male and female plants will mostly be kind of underground, but with the males it kind of protrudes a little bit more and is kind of more conical. As the females, their cones are a little bit shorter and kind of flatter as well. And the females will produce seed, but take care because these seeds are extremely toxic. Nothing else on the plant is toxic that I think of, but the seeds that they produce can kill. Even 1 to 2 seeds can be fatally toxic. So make sure that if you do have a female, that you don't have kids or any young kids that like to put things in their mouths, or any cats, dogs, or horses, because it can be fatal to all 3. But if it's not spring or whenever this guy's producing its seed, you're fine. I've had this guy for almost a year now, and it's dropped 1 or 2 leaves, I think. That's one of the reasons why I really like it, because it hardly ever drops any leaves, and it doesn't take a whole lot of water, but it can be fatal with the seeds, so just remember that also. Alright, I'm gonna go ahead and start the transplant now. I've got my Sterilite little bucket to catch any of the soil that I can. And actually, first of all, what I'm going to do is take its new terracotta pot and put some soil in the bottom of it so that it will be ready for the plant when I am. Now, I've had a friend who's had one of these before, and he says that you can add some bark to it, kind of like bark nuggets, and they do like that. So if you want to kind of mix that in with the soil a little bit. But otherwise, I'm using a cacti and succulent soil. That way, it is really good on drainage. Next, I will switch that out to catch any of the soil that I can. Now, it rained here a couple days ago, so the soil is a little wet, but not too saturated. I feel like this might be a little bit easier. I can lay him down. I'm just going to push out the bottom. And like I said, I did have this guy sitting outside for a long time, like all summer. So, just take your time. You might see a bug or two, but don't worry. They're just as scared of you as you are of them. Get your sanitized pruning shears and your root rake and just go to town. The root rakes are very, very, very important if you want to get this done in no time at all. Now, when I was young and dumb, I didn't use them. Instead, I used my fingers, and it takes forever. And even with forever, you don't get as close or as deep into the soil and the roots as you can with a root rake. This allows you to loosen up all the soil around the roots and separate the roots without hurting the roots. Now, of course, some of it will be knocked off, but that's natural, mostly the dead parts of the roots or the odor parts. And there are tiny little spikes on the stems, probably where for protection, that might have been around where the other leaves were, but they can kind of scratch you. They won't cut you too deep, but just take care of that. You may want to be wearing gloves. Now, as you can see, I'm just doing this pretty cautiously. You don't want to be very violent with it, because you will nick the roots and maybe even some green parts up here, and any kind of laceration will be a potential entry point for disease or rot or anything of that nature. Now, if you do see a spot that you did nick that has a pretty large laceration, the best thing to do is to take some all-natural cinnamon or 100% cinnamon. Cinnamon is actually an antibacterial, and actually can help fight any kind of disease that may enter your plant. But all you need to do is just take some all natural cinnamon and sprinkle over the little laceration, and it should help your plant fight off any kind of infection. Now, I'm not really doing a whole lot in the way of removal here. It is almost winter time, and I probably could have picked a better time to do this, because the plant will go into a little bit of a light resting, but with most trees, you can replant in the fall. So, and all I'm doing here is just removing a lot of mass, because I'm putting this guy in a new home, so I don't want him to start off all cramped. And I'm going to cut back a little bit of the roots just to keep him happy and give him a good start so he's not all cramped. Now remember, you can remove up to 3/4 of your plant's root mass without actually doing any harm to the plant. And just as I said before, always sanitize your root rake or root hook and the pruning shears before touching all over this plant, especially if you've used it before, just because you can pass disease and infections between plants. So make sure you sanitize either with rubbing alcohol or hot soapy water. Now, what I hear is that propagation through these guys is very, very, very difficult, just because they have to be cross-pollinated. They like to be germinated in sand, and the temperature needs to be at least 65 degrees, and they're not viable for very long, because they will go bad. So you have to actually plant them just as soon as you see any kind of leaves growing off of them. They will not stay viable for long. So what I was getting at is that these plants do get offsets. And as you can tell, I've got two right here. Now, if I wanted to, which I may just because it looks a little loose anyways, take your little root rake and kind of dig more in there and remove all this soil. And you can actually grab that offset and separate it. But it does give my plant quite some mass, and it looks like he's in there pretty good. Usually I would just take him and pull him off, and he would come off really easily. So, I'm gonna set him down here while I get his new pot ready. And once again, you better believe it, I sanitized and cleaned out this pot that I got at Walmart, I think. Now, I know me, I'm really bad about whenever I want a new pot, I'll take a plant, especially if I'm buying a new plant and I want a new pot for the plant, I will take that plant and set it down in a pot, or at least right next to it to make sure it looks really good. So I know you might think this plant or this pot hasn't had a plant in it, it's not dirty, it'll be fine. But there are people out there that do that and set them down in there. So you can probably pass pests along. Now I know a lot of pests won't actually live unless it's actually on a plant. So if anything else, it's just giving it a fresh start because it's nice and clean. So I always clean my pots out, especially if I'm about to put a brand new plant down in it. Now, the cones and the roots all need to be under the soil, but with the male, I believe I do have a male here, you want to leave about an inch or two above the soil. So I'll probably try to get it to right about here, a little bit lower than the pot, and he should be in there pretty good. So, as I always say, you could have help doing this, or you can use one of these guys, the soil scoops. They are awesome. Put the soil in a lot easier, and hold the plant yourself. And then as you add in the soil, just take some time to actually make sure your plant is centered. It is where you want it to be, because adding soil in will knock it about. And then as I get a nice ring of the soil around it, I'll add in a couple bark chips. Now I'm not adding in a whole lot. Just about a handful and a nice ring around the plant. And then kind of mix it in with the soil. That's probably about all that I'll put in. You add the soil in. Make sure you take your hands and kind of tamp down the soil to eliminate any kind of air bubbles that are in there down around the roots. The roots do not like air bubbles down in there. So if you just add the soil without tamping down your soil, then you leave air bubbles in there, which can kill the roots and in turn your plant. Now you're not pressing really hard, tamp it down fairly lightly, and then add more soil. Alright, now that I've made a nice little mess, I'm going to tap down some more soil, and I'm fairly happy with about where the soil is now. Like I said, you don't want the whole cone under the soil, but you do want a good amount of it to be kind of under soil. Now the smaller cone is really kind of down in there with a lot of soil, and the larger one looks like it could use a little bit more. So I'm gonna wait probably a little bit and see how it does, but I'll probably end up adding more soil, at least to about where these stems are coming off. And I did forget to mention earlier that with these pots, any pot, you do kind of want to rinse them out, but with terracotta, they do breathe. So if you didn't know it, you'll probably end up washing it ad infinitum because it looks like soap suds are still in the bottom of the pot, when really it's just very porous and the air is able to get in and out. Therefore, it looks like it's kind of expelling air and breathing. So the bubbles will kind of look like soap suds. So you don't have to keep washing and washing and washing and washing and thinking, why isn't the soap disappearing? Because after a while, it's mainly just gas coming from the pot. And that's a particular reason why I did use a terracotta pot, because with water, the biggest problem with cardboard palm is rot. Now these cones are meant to stay kind of fat and swell up a little bit just because it's able to hold water, so it's able to make it through a drought. But if you get too much water on the cones, they can suffer from stem rot. You just want to water it just like you would with an African violet, and try not to get it on the actual plant, but mainly just to the soil. So whenever I water mine, I just kind of go in a circle, use maybe like a hose or one of those watering cans that's really narrow so that you can kind of add water to the soil and let it dry out completely between waterings, because the roots will suffer from rot too, and fairly quickly. And now terracotta pot, as I was saying, they are porous, so it will kind of wick the water away from the soil. But if you're in an area like me in northern Kentucky, we get a lot of rain, always. So this plant, it needs a lot of light. It likes to be outside in direct light, at least 5 to 8 hours or more of sunlight a day. But it can also do relatively well in kind of a brighter indirect light too. But with these guys, like I was saying, if it gets too much water, and in Kentucky it's really hard for me because it'll be bright and sunny one day and rain really quickly the next. So you'll want to keep in mind on that if you do end up getting this plant. Any other pests that really kind of give a problem with this plant, I want to say spider mites. And you can tell those just by any kind of filaments that are connecting the plant or any leaves. It looks similar to like spider webs, and if you see a lot of that on there, you probably do have spider mites. Spider mites are really difficult to detect by the naked eye. A lot of times the only way they're able to be identified is through their filaments, and if you have those, the best way to get rid of them is to take the plant out back and use a garden hose and apply a bunch of water, and it'll knock the pests right off of there. Give it a couple days, and if you go back and look at it and you still see more filaments, I would take some rubbing alcohol and apply it to a washcloth, and take that washcloth and go over every side of every leaf and every stem and down around the cone as best you can. But since the cone is kind of jagged and a lot of it's underground, you may end up having to soak it a couple of times. You may even have to get neem oil involved. It's really organic. But that's really the only problems I've ever seen with the cardboard plant is spider mites and then kind of rot. Now I know that there may be one or two other ones, but I really haven't seen any with mine. Again, as I was saying, you want to have soil that is great for drainage. That's why I put the bark nuggets in there, and I've used the cacti and succulent mix. It's got ample sand in there that'll help with the drainage, and make sure your pot has adequate drainage holes in it as well. These plants do not like to be in saturated soggy soils, and if you do have a saucer underneath the pot to collect the excess water, always make sure you drain that every time you water the plant and an excess runs out the bottom. The key to watering this guy is a lot and pretty infrequently. So each time you do it, give it a whole lot of water so that it'll actually come out the bottom. This ensures that you've watered every root, because roots that have gone for several months without any water at all will begin to die off, and if it does enough, it will kill your plant. Temperature. These guys are slightly cold hardy, and I mean that just, I think they can tolerate any kind of temperature in Florida or any of the climate zones in Florida. I'm not sure if northern Florida is adequate with these guys, but I know central and southern Florida is, and I believe I said earlier it's zones 10 and 11. And in fact, in 2007, this plant was actually named a top gardening plant in Florida by the Flora Nursery Growers and Landscape Association. 2007, they voted this plant as one of the top plants for any kind of gardening. Like I said, they do really well outside, but only if you're in zones 10 through 11. If not, you're going to have it as a container plant, which I do, and they make really good indoor plants as well. And the reason why I say that is because these guys actually tolerate pretty dry air relatively well, and being brought inside for the wintertime, I know our homes get really kind of dry and arid, and that actually gives this guy a little bit of an advantage. So they don't need a whole lot in the way of humidity. It's mainly just kind of average and low humidity, but if you can tell the stems and the leaves are turning brown, it may be time for watering or just a good spritz, or even bring out your humidifier. This plant will tell you if it's not doing too well, but in the spring and the summertime, you really want to kind of pay attention to the cone, because if the cone starts to dry out and get all crispy and brown, the plant could end up dying. So in the spring and the summertime, you want to give it some water, enough to let it dry out in between. I wait until about the top inch to 2 inches is actually dry, meaning that I stick my finger down in there, and when I pull it back out, I don't really see any soil on there or any kind of granules on there at all. So, but in the wintertime, I usually only give them water maybe once every 3 to 4 weeks. I let it dry out pretty considerably between waterings in the wintertime. Fertilizer, I really only feed this guy once a month in the spring and summer times, if I even do that at all. They can be fed using a general purpose for like cacti and succulents. Those do really well with this guy, but you don't need to give them a whole lot in the way of nutrients. Now, as you know, I use the Miracle-Gro cacti and succulent and citrus soil, and that has enough food in there for about 6 months. So now I will not feed him again until about this spring or the summer, just because you don't want to really burn your plant out. Now, I've had this guy for about a year now, and I don't know too many other growers that have this plant. Most people I know have the Sago palms, but I did want to kind of shed some light on this guy and hopefully restore its popularity. This guy's really easy to take care of. Like I said, he likes bright light, a little bit of watering in the spring and summer. I would probably water it about every week to every 2 weeks, depending on how hot it is outside. In the wintertime, I would go every 3 to 4 weeks, and just kind of watch your cone. Your cone will tell you if it's not getting a whole lot of water and needs some more. But other than that, that's really all I can think to tell you about these guys. If you have a comment or a question, be sure to leave that for me, and I will try to get back to you as soon as possible. And while you're at it, hit the subscribe button or the bell next to it. That way you'll know anytime that I've uploaded a new video. You guys take it easy, have a good one, and don't forget, always plant prudently. Thank you, YouTube.